On a cold night in the autumn of 1935, on a narrow sidewalk in the Pigalle district of Paris, a small woman stood against a stone wall and sang for coins. She was barely 5 feet tall, thin, dressed in clothes too worn for the weather, her hands red from the cold. But her voice did not belong to that street. It rose above the traffic, above the clatter of the cafes, and it stopped people where they stood. Passers-by dropped a few centimes into a cap on the ground and hurried on, not quite understanding why the sound had reached so deep into them. She had done this for years. She would sing until her throat gave out, gather what little the night had given her, and disappear into the dark before morning. There was no plan beyond the next song and the next handful of coins. There had never been the luxury of a plan, but this night took a different shape. A dark automobile that had been moving with the traffic slowed as it neared her corner. Then it slowed further. It did not pass, it stopped. A well-dressed man inside rolled down the window and listened, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. He simply watched the small figure singing under the lamplight, as if he were trying to decide whether he had truly heard what he thought he had heard, or whether the cold and the late hour were playing a trick on him. Then he opened the door and stepped out onto the sidewalk, and the direction of her entire life was about to turn on a single sentence he had not yet spoken. Her name then was Edith Giovanna Gassion. The world did not yet know her as Edith Piaf. She had come up through hardship that would have silenced most people. Poverty, instability, a childhood passed between hard places and harder years. A life that had asked her to grow up long before she should have had to. By the time she was standing on that corner, she had already learned the lesson the streets teach earliest and most often, that life takes far more than it gives, and that anything good is usually followed by its price. And yet, when she sang, something happened that could not be explained by any of it. Her voice was not trained. It was not polished. It carried the accent of the streets and the rough edges of a life lived without comfort. But it was enormous. It came out of that small body with a force that seemed impossible, as if everything she had endured had gathered itself into sound and found a way out. It carried a feeling most trained singers spend their whole lives trying to reach and never do. When she sang about loss, people believed her because she was not performing loss. She knew it. She had lived it, and the audience could hear the difference even if they could not name it. That was the paradox standing on the sidewalk that night. A young woman the world had overlooked at every turn, holding inside her one of the most extraordinary instruments Paris would ever hear. She did not know it yet, but the very hardness of her life was the thing that made her impossible to ignore once someone finally heard her. All she had ever needed was one person to truly stop and listen. To understand what happened on that sidewalk, you have to understand the Paris she was singing in. In 1935, Pigalle was a district that never fully slept. Its streets were lined with cabarets, dance halls, and small clubs where music spilled out of every doorway, and its corners belonged to the people the bright rooms had no place for. For every glittering stage inside, there were dozens of singers on the pavement outside, working for whatever strangers chose to give them. Street singing was not romantic, it was survival. You sang in the cold, in the rain, over the noise of drunken laughter, and you competed with 100 others for the attention of people who had somewhere better to be. You learned to read a crowd in seconds, to hold a note until a hurried stranger slowed, to make an entire life fit into one song before the moment passed. Most of those voices were never heard again. They rose for a few winters and then vanished, remembered by no one, their names never written down anywhere. The young woman against the wall knew this world completely. She had been born into it. She had grown up among performers, poverty, and the hard mercy of the streets, moving from one uncertain place to the next. To the people hurrying past, she was one more anonymous singer in a city full of them, worth a coin at most, and a second glance almost never. No one walking through Pigalle that night could have guessed that this particular voice, rising from this particular corner, was about to be pulled out of the crowd forever. When Leplee finally spoke, he did not offer her money. He offered her something she had never truly been offered in her life. He asked her to come and sing in his club. To the young woman on the sidewalk, the words must have sounded almost impossible. Le Journeys was a world she had only ever imagined from the outside. A room of chandeliers and evening dress and people who would not have met her eyes on the street. Its doors did not open for girls from the corners of Pigalle. And she was afraid. Fear was reasonable. She had learned, again and again, that hope was a dangerous thing to hold. That the higher you were lifted, the further there was to fall. She had no stage clothes. She had no formal training. She had never stood in front of that kind of audience in her life, and part of her surely wondered whether this elegant stranger was mistaken, or worse, whether she would walk into that room and be laughed back out onto the street. Everything about the offer felt like a door that could close on her as quickly as it had opened. But Leplee did not waver. He had made up his mind on that curb, and he told her plainly that he believed she had something the polished singers of Paris did not, something none of them could buy or learn. He gave her a date to appear. He told her to come. And in that moment, the choice stopped being his. It became hers. The man who had stopped his car was named Louis Leplee. He was not a casual passerby. He owned one of the more fashionable nightclubs in Paris, a cabaret called Le Journeys, located near the Champs-Élysées, far from the rough corners of Pigalle. Leplee moved among a different world entirely. His clientele were the well-dressed, the wealthy, the people who came to Paris nights expecting polish and elegance. And they expected the man who ran their favorite room to give them exactly that. But Leplee had an ear, and more than that, he had an instinct. He had spent his life around performers, and he knew that real talent was rare and unmistakable, and that it almost never arrived looking the way people expected. It often appeared where no one thought to look. When he heard that voice rising off the pavement, he did not hear a street singer. He heard something he could not walk away from. He had sat through countless performers in polished rooms who sang beautifully and moved no one at all, technically perfect and completely empty. And here, on a cold curb, a girl in a worn dress had reached across the noise of the street and taken hold of him before he had even decided to listen. Leplee understood immediately what most people never learn, that what he was hearing did not happen twice. that a voice like this passes a man once in his life if he is fortunate. The question was no longer whether she had the gift. The question was whether this frightened young woman would believe him. The moment she began to sing, the elegant room of Le Journey's went quiet. The conversation stopped. The glasses stayed on the tables. The fashionable people who had come expecting a pleasant evening found themselves leaning forward, unable to look away from the small figure in the plain, dark dress. That enormous voice, the one that had risen off a cold Pigalle sidewalk, filled the room and pinned everyone to their chairs. It did not ask for their attention. It took it. It was rough. It was raw. It carried a lifetime of hardship in every note, and it did not apologize for any of it. And it was more real than anything most of them had ever heard in a polished room in their lives. They were not listening to a performance. They were listening to a life. It is said that among the guests that night was Maurice Chevalier, already one of the biggest names in French entertainment. And when it was over, he was heard to say, in effect, that this little one had it, the thing that cannot be taught, the thing that separates the ones who move a room from the ones who merely fill it. The girl the streets had overlooked had just silenced a room full of people who had every reason to look down on her, and instead they were on their feet. In the space of a single song, the woman who had sung for coins became someone Paris would be talking about by morning. The sparrow had a voice, and now the city had heard it. The night of her debut at Le Journey's, everything that could feel wrong felt wrong. She was terrified. She had nothing suitable to wear, and the story that has followed her ever since is that she arrived with a plain dark dress and a half-finished sleeve, a sweater she had been knitting and never completed in time. To the elegant crowd inside, she must have looked like a mistake, a girl who had wandered in from the wrong part of the city. Leplee looked at the frightened, unpolished girl in front of him and understood something important. He would not try to dress her up as one of them. He would not try to hide what she was. He would present it exactly as it was and trust the voice to do the rest. And he gave her the name that Paris would never forget. Because she was so small, so bird-like, so fragile against the size of what was about to happen, he called her La Piaf, the little sparrow. It was slang from the street, plain and affectionate, and it was perfect, because it did not pretend she was something she was not. It made her smallness part of the wonder. Backstage, she trembled. She could hear the murmur of the room beyond the curtain, full of exactly the kind of people who had walked past her on the sidewalk for years without slowing down. And then, Louis Leplee gave her the smallest push forward, a hand at her back and a few quiet words. The little sparrow stepped out into the light. The nights that followed changed everything. Under the name Louis Leplee had given her, she began to draw crowds. Word spread through Paris that a strange little singer at Le Journey's carried a voice that could stop a room, and people came to see for themselves whether the rumor could possibly be true. The story did not stay simple for long. Within a year, Louis Leplee, the man who had pulled her off the street, was gone, lost to a crime that shook the city and left her grieving the very person who had first believed in her. For a time, it threatened to pull her back down into the shadows she had come from. But the door he opened could not be closed again. She kept singing. She took the name he had given her, shortened it, and carried it forward until it belonged to the whole world. La Môme Piaf became simply Edith Piaf. The voice that had once competed with traffic on a Pigalle corner would one day fill the Olympia, cross oceans, sing before American audiences, and reach into the hearts of people who had never set foot in Paris and never would. And it all turned on one cold night. One man who stopped his car when he did not have to, and one sentence spoken to a frightened girl against a wall. She had always had the voice. It had been there on that corner all along, waiting in the cold with her. What changed that night was not the voice. It was that, for the first time, someone truly stopped to listen. One car, one man, one sentence. That was the whole distance between a forgotten street singer and a legend. And once Paris finally heard her, it never stopped listening again.